Everyone in the neighborhood said he was harmless, just an old man with a quiet life, a retired senior who liked his mornings slow and predictable. But that morning, the knock on the door shattered everything. Sharp, demanding, impossible to ignore. He opened it to find a stern HOA officer standing there, clipboard in hand, eyes cold, voice like gravel. "Your property is in violation," the officer said, like it was obvious, like it had always been obvious. A violation over a bucket. A ladder. That's it, that's what would cost him everything. He stared at them, his hands trembling, not from age but from disbelief. How could something so small, so trivial, turn into a war threatening his home of 40 years? He had mowed the lawn every week, painted the fences, never even trimmed a tree without permission. Yet here they were, citing rules he hadn't even read in years, demanding fines that made his heart skip. $500, $1,000, and then looming over him, $4,000 a month if he didn't comply. He could almost hear the weight of each zero pressing against his chest, suffocating, unrelenting. He thought of the mornings he had spent on that porch, sipping tea, waving at neighbors, telling stories to children who had grown up running along the sidewalk. That porch wasn't just wood and nails, it was memory. It was his life. And now it was at risk because of a bucket left next to the shed. A ladder leaned against the garage. Rules that had always been there but had never mattered until today. He sat in the living room, the letter trembling in his hands, staring at the floor. Fear clawed at him, but so did something else, pride. He had worked hard his entire life. Retired early, saved, lived simply, treated everyone with kindness. And now he was being judged by strangers in suits who measured dignity in cubic inches of perfectly organized storage, not in years of care, not in the kindness he had sown into the neighborhood. The memories came unbidden. His wife long gone, smiling as he built a birdhouse in the yard. His children now scattered across states, laughing at his terrible pancake flips. Friends who had moved away, still calling, still joking about the old man who had a ladder problem bigger than most people's mortgage troubles. And now this, an invisible enemy. Faceless, relentless, uncaring. He thought about walking away, selling the house, moving somewhere far, somewhere anonymous. But something deep inside him whispered no. This wasn't just a house, it was history, it was legacy. It was every Sunday barbecue, every snowball fight, every whispered promise to a neighbor to keep an eye out. He couldn't just hand it over, not like this. Not to a bureaucracy that didn't see him as a person. So he did the only thing he could think of. He stood up. Not angrily, not with fire, but with a quiet determination that made even the walls of the old house feel sturdier. He would fight. Slowly, meticulously, he would dig in. Gather his paperwork, his memories, his neighbors' support. He would show them that behind the bucket and the ladder was a life, a history, a man who had given more than he had taken. And somewhere, deep in that rising tide of fear and disbelief, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe justice wasn't about how many rules you could bend or break. Maybe it was about resilience, about the courage to stand when the world tells you to sit down, about proving that a person's dignity could not be measured in fines or citations, but in the quiet, stubborn way they refused to be erased. He didn't know what the next day would bring. He didn't know if the HOA would relent, if neighbors would rally, if courts would understand. But he knew one thing, the bucket, the ladder, the fines. They were nothing compared to the story of a life lived fully, patiently, bravely. And he was ready to make them listen. He woke before dawn, the house still asleep, the world outside painted in muted shades of gray. Sleep didn't come easy anymore, not since the knock, not since the letter. He moved quietly through the rooms, each step echoing in the hollow spaces of memories that seemed almost fragile now. The kitchen smelled faintly of yesterday's coffee, but even that comfort felt distant. His hands gripped the counter, knuckles white. How had something so small grown so monstrous? A bucket, a ladder. And yet, it felt like a battle for his very soul. He thought about calling someone, friends, family, but hesitation held him back. Pride, stubbornness, perhaps fear mingled with it. He wanted to face this alone first, to measure the battlefield before asking for reinforcements. But even in solitude, the weight pressed down, and questions gnawed relentlessly. How could a neighborhood meant to protect its residents turn against one of its own? How could decades of good deeds mean nothing to a rulebook in a binder, stamped and signed by people who didn't know his name? He wandered into the yard, frost still clinging to the edges of the lawn. The ladder leaned against the garage, its shadow stretching long in the morning light. The bucket rested where it had always been, plain, unremarkable, innocent. And yet they had become symbols of something darker, of injustice, of bureaucracy run amok, of a system that measured life in conformity rather than character. He reached out, touched the cool metal of the ladder, and for a moment he felt a strange kinship with it. Upright, unyielding, essential, yet under threat for simply existing. Neighbors began to stir. From across the street, a woman stepped out, coffee in hand, eyes narrowing as she saw him staring at the ladder. "They can't do this, can they?" she asked softly, almost to herself. He shook his head. He didn't have the answer, but the question itself gave him a spark. Maybe he wasn't alone. Maybe this fight wasn't just his. Maybe it was about more than fines and rules. Maybe it was about defending a way of life, about standing for something greater than fear. The mailbox creaked. Another envelope. Another demand, another threat. $4,000. $4,000 a month. Every time he read it, it was as if the ink etched itself into his chest. But he forced himself to breathe slowly, carefully, grounding himself in memories of resilience. He remembered his father, stern but fair, teaching him that courage was measured not in absence of fear, but in persistence despite it. And he realized he had that courage. He had always had it. Maybe he had just forgotten, lulled into comfort by decades of calm. By mid-morning, he was at the HOA office. The building loomed, sterile and imposing, windows reflecting the sun like eyes watching, judging. He walked in, shoulders straight, voice steady even though his heart raced. The receptionist looked up, polite but indifferent, as if thousands of people had walked these floors with the same story and left defeated. He asked to speak to the officer responsible. A sigh, a pause, and finally a name. The man who had sent the letters, who had knocked on his door, who had turned something as simple as a ladder into a weapon. When they met, it was worse than he imagined. The officer's eyes were cold, unyielding. Rules, regulations, precedent, all delivered like a hammer striking wood. Every word a reminder that he was a minor inconvenience, a pest, a problem to be erased. And yet within him a fire burned. The quiet fire of years spent building, loving, protecting. He told the officer nothing about his fear, nothing about the nights spent awake imagining his home slipping away. He only asked, carefully, insistently, "Is there a way to fix this, to make it right without losing everything?" The officer's pause was the longest silence of the day. In that moment, uncertainty hung in the air. And as he left the building, he realized something. This fight was bigger than him, but so was his resolve. Every step back to his house felt heavier, yes, but also firmer. He was no longer just reacting. He was preparing for the next letter, the next meeting, the next obstacle. He would gather evidence, gather witnesses, gather courage. And maybe, just maybe, he would show them that a life cannot be reduced to fines or citations, that dignity has a weight no rulebook can measure. At the edge of his driveway, he paused and looked at the ladder. The bucket. Innocent, ordinary, unremarkable. And yet they had become symbols of his defiance, of his determination to stand when others would let go. And in that quiet moment, the neighborhood, his life, felt a little more like something worth fighting for. The first time he realized this was no ordinary dispute, he felt it in the mail. Another envelope, thicker than the rest, stamped official, yet dripping with menace. The words inside weren't new, but the tone was sharper, colder. "Non-compliance will result in legal action." He read it 3 times, each repetition tightening the knot in his chest. $4,000 a month. Foreclosure. His home, the place that held 40 years of laughter, love, and quiet mornings, was now under threat for something as trivial as a bucket and ladder. He tried to steady himself, packing slowly through the living room, the walls lined with photographs of a lifetime. His wife smiling in a sunlit garden, his children laughing at birthday parties. Friends gathered on warm evenings, sharing drinks, stories, and advice. All those memories felt suddenly fragile, as if the thin paper in his hand could unravel decades of life. The injustice burned, not just in anger, but in sorrow. How could it come to this? How could a rule, cold and indifferent, hold such power over a life lived with care? Outside, the neighborhood seemed oblivious. Mailboxes jingled, sprinklers hissed over freshly cut lawns, children ran to school buses. Yet behind each door he imagined the same question forming quietly in people's minds. Could it happen to me? He realized he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. Every unfair citation, every arbitrary rule was a warning. And the weight of that responsibility settled on him like the morning frost on the grass, cold, sharp, undeniable. He went back to the ladder. It leaned against the garage as if nothing had changed. The bucket sat innocently beside it, a simple pair of objects that had become the battlefield. He touched the ladder, feeling its metal cool against his palm. It was a reminder that the fight wasn't about possessions. It was about respect, about dignity, about standing firm when every system designed to protect had turned against him. The phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. It was a neighbor, voice trembling. "They're sending someone over," she said, "to take pictures, to document. They're serious." Her fear was infectious, and yet he felt a strange resolve settle deeper in his chest. He wasn't alone. The whispers, the quiet solidarity of those who cared, gave him courage he hadn't realized he still possessed. Hours later, the officer arrived, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp as knives. He didn't speak at first. He simply walked around, taking pictures of the bucket, the ladder, every minor imperfection. Each click of the camera was a hammer on his heart, but he didn't flinch. He stood silently watching, letting the absurdity of the situation sink into the air around them. The officer paused, glancing at him, perhaps expecting fear or panic, but there was only calm determination. Quiet, stubborn. A man who had lived long enough to know that surrender was not the answer. Later that evening, he sat on the porch, staring at the sunset. The sky bled orange and pink, beautiful and cruel. Beautiful because it reminded him that the world still had wonder. Cruel because it marked the passing of time, the ticking closer of deadlines, the rising threat of foreclosure. He thought about his life, about the ordinary moments that had built it, and realized that the fight wasn't just for the house. It was for the principle. For the idea that a life's worth cannot be measured in citations or fees. As night fell, he made a list. Every letter, every photograph, every conversation with neighbors. Evidence, he told himself, not for revenge, but for justice. He would organize, strategize, and endure. Because if he let the rules and bureaucracy win without a fight, the loss would be more than his home. It would be the quiet surrender of dignity, of self-respect, of courage. And he refused to let that happen. In that quiet darkness, with only the faint hum of streetlights and the distant bark of a dog for company, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: clarity. This wasn't just about a bucket and ladder. It was about life, fairness, and the stubborn resilience of the human spirit. And in that moment he made a silent vow: he would not yield. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. He heard the knock late that afternoon, a sound sharp enough to startle him from a rare moment of calm. He opened the door to see not one officer, but two, their badges gleaming in the fatting sunlight. Their faces were unreadable, professional, void of sympathy. Behind them, a small camera crew of sorts, people taking notes, snapping photos, documenting every inch of his property. They didn't smile, didn't explain. They only pointed at the ladder and the bucket, as if accusing him of a crime that had no witnesses, no jury, no explanation beyond the rulebook itself. For a moment he just stared. Then a quiet anger rose inside him, steady and unrelenting. Years of service, of honesty, of living quietly, responsibly. It meant nothing here. Not to them. To them, life was measured in citations, in conformity, in compliance. And yet he realized that anger alone would not save his home. It could fuel him, yes, but only careful planning and patience could win this fight. He retreated inside, shutting the door slowly, the echo of the lock resounding like a tiny shield against the world outside. He needed allies. He remembered Mrs. Patterson across the street, who always had a kind word, Mr. Lopez, who helped trim his hedges, even the teenagers who had grown up running past his driveway. They could testify to his care, his decency, his life woven into the community. It wasn't just about legality. It was about humanity, and he needed witnesses to remind the world of it. The night stretched long, filled with the ticking of clocks and the hum of his refrigerator. He drafted letters, organized photographs, made phone calls to neighbors, carefully recording every conversation, every promise of support. Each note, each small document felt like a shield, like an anchor in a storm that threatened to sweep away everything he had built. His hands ached, not from age but from the persistence of effort, and yet he did not stop. Sleep would come later. Survival required vigilance now. Days turned into a blur of meetings and calls. The HOA sent more letters, each one thicker, more threatening than the last. Legal jargon piled on legal jargon, rules stacked upon rules, warnings stacked upon warnings. Every envelope that arrived was a punch to the chest, yet he refused to bend. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to shift. Neighbors began to talk, quietly at first, then with louder voices, expressing disbelief at the cruelty and absurdity of fines for a bucket and a ladder. The whispers grew into murmurs, the murmurs into conversations at the grocery store, at the church, on porches across the neighborhood. He found himself standing at the edge of his driveway one afternoon, watching people gather, cautious but curious. Faces that once ignored him now lingered, offering support, sharing their stories, asking questions he could barely answer himself. In their eyes he saw hope, a fragile, flickering light, but enough to keep the shadows at bay. Perhaps this fight was no longer just his. Perhaps the battle for fairness, for dignity, had touched something deeper in the community. And yet, even with support, the fear remained. Every night he imagined the foreclosure notice arriving, imagined packing boxes, imagining leaving behind the life he had built from nothing. His home was more than wood and nails. It was a witness to every small victory, every quiet act of kindness, every memory etched into its walls. The thought of losing it was unbearable. But the fire within him burned brighter than the fear. Every conversation, every letter, every visit from a neighbor fortified his resolve. He realized something crucial. The battle wasn't just about the house. It was about justice, about standing firm when the world demanded compliance without conscience. It was about showing that even one person, one life, could resist the tide of injustice without surrendering who they were. As night fell and the streetlights flickered on, he stood at the window, looking at the ladder and bucket, the ordinary objects that had become the symbols of defiance. Somewhere between the fear and the determination, he found clarity. The fight was far from over, but he was no longer fighting alone. And for the first time in weeks, a tentative sense of hope settled over him. A promise that maybe, just maybe, right could prevail against rules gone mad. The first notice from the attorney arrived like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile calm he had built. The envelope was thick, intimidating, its contents a formal demand for compliance, complete with deadlines and threats of legal action. $4,000 a month, foreclosure looming. Each word felt like a hammer striking not his house, but his spirit. He sank into the armchair, gripping the letter so tightly his knuckles whitened, wondering how life had taken such a cruel turn over something as simple as a bucket and ladder. He thought about the mornings spent sipping coffee on the porch, the laughter of children across the street, the quiet satisfaction of a well-kept yard. All of it memories, legacy, history, now seemed fragile, teetering on the edge of obliteration. Fear tried to creep in, wrapping itself around his chest, whispering that perhaps it was time to give up, to sell, to flee. But in that fear, a spark of determination ignited. He could not, would not, let decades of life be erased by faceless rules and indifferent bureaucracy. He called his neighbors one by one, explaining the situation carefully, almost pleadingly. To his surprise, their outrage mirrored his own. Mrs. Patterson offered to testify about his care for the property. Mr. Lopez recounted decades of neighborly help. Even some of the teenagers, now young adults, promised to stand by him. Slowly, a small coalition formed, not out of rebellion, but out of a shared sense of justice. Together, they began compiling statements, photos, and timelines, proof that this was not a man shirking responsibility, but one under siege for trivialities that defied common sense. The HOA, sensing resistance, escalated. New letters arrived daily, warnings stacked atop warnings, each one more intimidating than the last. The officers made visits, scrutinizing every corner of the property, every minor detail. Each time they left, he felt the weight of surveillance pressing against his chest, but he refused to be cowed. The bucket remained where it belonged, the ladder steadfast against the garage wall, silent witnesses to the absurdity of the fight. Late one night, he sat in the dim light of his study, legal documents spread across the table, his hands trembling from exhaustion and frustration. He wondered how the world had come to value conformity over kindness, rules over humanity. The thought gnawed at him. Had the system been built to protect or to punish? And in that quiet darkness, he realized that the fight was not just about the house or the bucket or the ladder. It was about standing up to a system that sought to diminish a person's dignity for no reason other than blind adherence to arbitrary rules. The days that followed blurred together, a relentless rhythm of letters, phone calls, and meetings. The community's support grew, small gestures becoming a chorus of solidarity. Neighbors left notes of encouragement, sent emails of support, and some even attended HOA meetings to speak on his behalf. Each act was a reminder that he was not alone, that courage, like fear, could spread through a community, creating strength where isolation once reigned. And yet doubt lingered. Each night he imagined the worst: the foreclosure notice, the eviction, the dismantling of a life carefully constructed over decades. But in the same imagination, he also saw something else. Neighbors standing with him, voices raised in protest, the absurdity of the fines exposed, and finally, a courtroom where fairness could be measured not by rules alone, but by principle. By the end of that week, he understood something vital. Resilience was not about never feeling fear. It was about refusing to let fear dictate action. It was about showing up, even when the odds seemed insurmountable, and insisting that one life, one voice could matter. And in that realization, he found a fragile hope, a small flame to guide him through the mounting storm. As he looked out the window at the bucket and ladder, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, he whispered to himself, "They may have rules, they may have power, but they do not have the history, the heart, or the dignity that makes a life worth defending." And for now, that was enough to keep fighting. The courthouse loomed ahead like a fortress, cold stone walls reflecting the morning sun, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. He felt the weight of every step as if the bricks themselves bore witness to his decades of quiet life. Each echo of his shoes on the marble floor was a reminder. Today, the fight was no longer a letter or a photograph. It was real, legal, tangible. The air was tense, the kind of tension that presses against your chest and makes each breath a conscious effort. Inside, the room smelled of polished wood and anxious anticipation. The judge, impartial and stern, shuffled papers at the bench, while the HOA attorney exuded an air of certainty that made his stomach twist. He gripped the edges of his folder, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the knowledge that everything hung in the balance. He had spent nights organizing evidence, collecting testimonies, documenting every inch of his property, yet the anxiety gnawed relentlessly. Would it be enough? Could they see beyond the rules to the life behind them? The hearing began with the HOA attorney presenting his case. Each word was precise, clipped, weaponized. The bucket, the ladder, the violations, meticulously described, cataloged, almost ritualistically repeated. Their tone suggested inevitability, an unspoken assumption that the system, no matter how unreasonable, would prevail. He listened quietly, absorbing every claim, feeling a surge of disbelief and determination. How could decades of integrity be weighed against a ladder, against a bucket? When it was his turn to speak, he rose slowly, carefully, letting the room settle into silence. He didn't shout, didn't plead desperately. He spoke with quiet force, recounting memories of the neighborhood, the small acts of kindness that had defined his life, the care he had taken of his home, and the absurdity of being judged by arbitrary rules. He presented neighbors' statements, photographs, timelines, proof that this was a life under siege for reasons that defied reason itself. Each word carried the weight of years, and slowly he could sense a shift in the room. The judge asked questions, each one deliberate, testing the edges of his composure, probing for weakness. He answered honestly, calmly, refusing to let frustration or fear show. And in that room, amid the sterile authority of law, he discovered something profound. Courage is not loud. It is steady. It is the quiet insistence that your life, your dignity, and your home are worth defending, even when the world seems set against you. Outside the courthouse, neighbors gathered quietly, holding their presence as a silent shield. Their support, simple and unspoken, bolstered him more than any argument could. He realized then that this fight was no longer solitary. It was about community, about fairness, about the idea that one person's courage could inspire many. And in that shared resolve, fear became less dominant, replaced by a strange mixture of pride and defiance. Days passed, letters continued to arrive, but now they carried a different tone. The HOA seemed cautious, as if realizing that their opponent was not a man to be easily intimidated. And at home, the bucket and ladder remained exactly where they belonged, silent symbols of resistance, resilience, and unwavering dignity. Each glance at them reminded him why he fought, why he could not and would not surrender. Late at night, he reflected on the journey so far. The fear, the exhaustion, the relentless pressure, it was all part of the story, part of proving that life could not be measured in compliance alone. The bucket, the ladder, the HOA, they were obstacles, but the real test was within him. Could he maintain integrity, patience, and resolve when everything seemed designed to break him? He felt a quiet satisfaction knowing he had not only answered that question for himself, but had shown the world the quiet strength that comes from living with dignity. And as he sat on his porch, watching the streetlights flicker and the neighborhood settle into quiet, he felt something rare, hope solid and unshakable. He had faced letters, threats, and legal hurdles, yet the story was far from over. But one thing was clear. No rule, no citation, no arbitrary threat could ever erase the life he had lived or the courage he had discovered within himself. The first time he saw the final notice in bold, red ink, his stomach sank like a stone in a river. Immediate compliance required or legal action will escalate. The words seemed to leap off the page, sharp and accusing. He gripped the envelope, fingers trembling, but this time there was no panic, only a quiet, simmering determination. The battle had reached its climax. This was no longer about letters or photos. This was a confrontation that would decide the fate of everything he had built, everything he had loved. He stepped outside, the bucket and ladder catching the late afternoon sunlight, casting long, unwavering shadows on the driveway. To anyone else, they were ordinary objects. But to him, they were symbols, silent, steadfast, unyielding. He had come to understand that the fight wasn't about the items themselves. It was about dignity. About standing firm when every system around you demands that you bend, break, or vanish quietly. Neighbors began appearing one by one, drawn by curiosity, concern, or solidarity. Some carried coffee, some simply nodded, some offered quiet words of encouragement. A sense of community, fragile yet undeniable, had formed around him. Their presence was more powerful than any letter, more intimidating than any officer, more protective than any rulebook. It was a reminder that courage, once shown, could ripple outward, touching others and creating a shield of human connection stronger than bureaucracy itself. The HOA, sensing resistance, escalated in ways he had not anticipated. Another inspection, more photographs, threats of court costs, liens, fines, but with each action his resolve deepened. He meticulously documented every visit, every interaction, every attempt to intimidate him. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, yet he felt a strange satisfaction. He was no longer merely defending a house, he was defending a principle. He was saying, silently but loudly, that life, dignity, and justice mattered more than arbitrary rules enforced without compassion. The night before the final hearing, he sat in his study surrounded by evidence. Photographs of the property, neighbors' letters of support, legal documents. The weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him, but he focused on a simple truth. He had done everything he could. Every act of care, every document collected, every conversation held. He had prepared not out of hope of winning alone, but out of belief in the righteousness of standing up for what was right. And somehow that belief carried him forward, steadier than fear ever could. The morning of the hearing arrived, crisp and bright, with a sense of tension that made every breath deliberate. He walked into the courthouse, folder in hand, shoulders squared, mind focused. The HOA attorneys were already present, confident and precise, but he was no longer intimidated. He carried with him something they could not measure, decades of integrity, a life of honesty, and the quiet force of a community that had rallied behind him. When the judge called the case, he spoke with clarity and calm. He recounted the years he had lived on the property, the triviality of the cited violations, and the absurdity of threatening foreclosure over objects as innocent as a bucket and ladder. He presented evidence meticulously, letting the documents speak, letting neighbors' testimonies echo through the courtroom like a chorus of unseen voices. Each word, each piece of proof, was a testament to the life he had led and the dignity he refused to surrender. Outside the courthouse, the neighborhood waited, holding their breath as if the outcome would not only decide his fate but affirm the values they all shared. And somewhere in the quiet, unspoken support of those watching, he felt a profound truth. Courage was contagious. Justice, once sought with steadfast patience and unwavering integrity, could prevail even against overwhelming odds. As the hearing concluded, he stepped outside, the sun warm on his face. The bucket and ladder, harmless objects to some, had become the symbols of a man who refused to be intimidated, a community that refused to be silenced, and a life that refused to be erased. He inhaled deeply, ready for whatever came next, knowing that no matter the outcome, he had already won something far greater, the knowledge that dignity, courage, and persistence could defy even the most unyielding forces. The morning sun spilled golden light across the neighborhood, soft and unwavering, as if offering its quiet blessing. He stood on the porch, hands resting on the railing, eyes fixed on the bucket and ladder that had become symbols of a struggle so much bigger than themselves. Today, the verdict would arrive. Today, the months of letters, threats, inspections, and legal maneuvering would culminate in a single decision that would either erase decades of life or affirm the principle he had fought for so fiercely. The HOA representatives arrived first, confident as ever, papers clutched tightly, pens ready to strike out words to assert authority. But the neighborhood was also there now, more than he could have imagined. Neighbors who had once waved from across the street, now standing united, murmuring support, their presence a silent roar. They weren't there to argue. They were there to witness, to remind everyone involved that life was not just rules on paper, that community, dignity, and humanity mattered more than citations and fines. Inside the small conference room, the tension was palpable. The HOA attorney began their usual routine, restating violations, emphasizing penalties, outlining the legal framework that had led them to this moment. But their words fell flat against the quiet force of his preparation. He spoke slowly, deliberately, recounting his life, the care he had taken, the absurdity of the fines, and the unwavering support of his community. Each story, each detail was a small hammer striking against the walls of bureaucracy, carving space for fairness, for justice, for common sense. As the minutes stretched into hours, something remarkable happened. Faces in the room began to shift, not in malice, not in anger, but in subtle recognition of the humanity before them. The officers, the attorneys, even the representatives began to pause to consider, to see not a rule breaker, but a man, a life, a history that could not be reduced to a citation. He had expected resistance, confrontation, perhaps even dismissal. What he did not expect was the quiet power of integrity and perseverance to create doubt, even in those trained to enforce rules without question. Finally, the decision arrived. The HOA would not pursue foreclosure. The fines would be reduced and a dialogue would begin about reasonable enforcement. Relief washed over him in waves. Relief, yes, but also awe at the journey that had brought him here. He looked around the room at neighbors who had stood silently, steadfast, watching, and felt a gratitude that words could scarcely contain. Their support had been the backbone of his courage, a reminder that even one person's stand could awaken the conscience of a community. Outside, the street was alive with whispers of triumph. People approached, shaking his hand, offering congratulations, sharing tears of relief. The bucket and ladder stood quietly in the driveway, unchanged, ordinary, yet now heroic symbols of what had been won. The neighborhood, once quiet, had awakened to a truth he had long known. Dignity, integrity, and resilience cannot be measured by rules alone. They are proven in the quiet acts of standing firm when the world expects surrender. That night he sat on the porch, the golden light of sunset fading into a calm, comforting dusk. The house was safe, the fight won, yet he felt something more profound. A sense of completion, of purpose fulfilled, not because he had defeated the HOA, but because he had preserved something essential about life itself. The battle had tested fear, endurance, patience, and resolve. It had illuminated a truth he had always known but now felt vividly. Sometimes courage is not a shout. Sometimes it is the quiet refusal to be erased, the steady insistence that life, dignity, and humanity matter above all else. He looked at the ladder leaning against the garage, the bucket resting beside it, and smiled. They were still ordinary, but they had become monuments, reminders of perseverance, of standing tall against absurdity, of fighting not just for a house, but for the life lived inside it. And somewhere deep in that quiet evening, he understood. Victories like this are measured not in money or rules, but in the strength of spirit, the loyalty of neighbors, and the courage to stand, even when the world seems determined to push you down. As the stars began to appear overhead, he whispered to himself, softly, resolutely, "This is what it means to fight. This is what it means to live with dignity. And this is worth everything." You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.